Chapter 2. The Idealism of Antimodernity. The Germany that we love and that we yearn to see has never existed and perhaps never will exist. Lagarde. Lagarde was one of the great critics of Imperial Germany. His Deutsche Schriften became a classic in cultural criticism. Few other works dealt so comprehensively and ruthlessly with the hidden weaknesses of Bismarck's empire: the loss of faith, the disunity of the people, the corruption of education, and the decline of morality. None combined this criticism with such passionate nationalism, and it was this combination that gave Lagarde his immense appeal. Lagarde first turned to Zeitcritic when he was 45 years old. Until then, except for two political speeches delivered in 1853 but not published, he had devoted himself to his scholarly work, and his only contact with the official world had been his intermittent conflict with it. Throughout the 1850s and 1860s, he felt estranged from German politics, and by 1872 his mood and the mood of his countrymen were radically different. While they were exulting over their military victory and national unification, Lagarde was looking ahead to the disasters he thought would overwhelm the new Reich. In his Deutsche Schriften, he sought to warn the people against the new and terrible dangers that would annihilate their true character and ultimately destroy Germany itself. He wrote as a prophet. He neither reasoned nor exposited, but poured out his excoriations and laments, his intuitive truths and promises. There was nothing limpid or systematic in his work. Within each essay he skipped from subject to subject, alternating abstract generalities and concrete proposals. The pervasive mood of the book was despair, and the dominant tone a kind of whiny heroism. As a lonely figure, uncommitted to any cause or party, Lagarde saw the weaknesses of every group in the new Germany. Much of what he wrote was exasperatingly remote from reality, yet some of his prognostications were remarkably perspicacious. He had the quickened sensibility of a wounded man, and was therefore more closely attuned to the sufferings of other men and the shortcomings of his culture than those healthy people who were caught up in the bounding advance of their society. Lagarde's plans for the restoration of religion, politics, and education, which are discussed in the following chapters, were held together not by any inner logic or philosophy, but by his vision of the nature of men and the destiny of Germany. Essentially, he was a moralist who saw the world and men in simple moral terms. Although the Germans of his day had succumbed to all sorts of evils and temptations, the German people still had a unique calling for the heroic moral life. As a prophet, he sought to teach his people to conquer its foes and recover its past greatness. It was hubris of Lagarde to avow and even believe that he was the prophet who would prepare Germany's rebirth. Nor did he want to be a prophet of God alone. He thought of himself and was hailed as the prophet of Germanism, or the Volkstum that was still unspoiled. Lagarde believed man to be a creature of will and energy and sentiment, for whom reason was of secondary importance. Quote, "The core of man is not his reason but his will, for like everything that is good, knowledge also enters through the will, whose wings are sensibility and imagination, and whose driving force is love." Man was a spiritual being, and the needs of his soul were far more important and irrepressible than the needs of his body. When Lagarde insisted that he was the last defender of German individualism, he was not thinking of political rights at all. He thought of himself as the last champion of the German character. He wanted to remake society so that the great individuals could realize themselves, and that no one would be deprived of his right to fulfill the plan that God has fashioned for him. Like so many believers in human greatness, Lagarde was oppressed by the frailty of men, afraid always that he would succumb to a new temptation. Lagarde thought that the German character would perish in material comfort, for men can thrive only on adversity and can grow only in perpetual struggle. Work and suffering are noble, and the worst vice was self-indulgence. The idea of human equality was a fraudulent myth, and the recognition of inequality a psychological necessity, because man's greatest joy is to revere other men, or to put it less extravagantly, to recognize other men above themselves, and to love and be loved by these men. Lagarde's moral thought was not original. We recognize the traditional fusion of Protestantism, especially Lutheranism, and the Prussian ethos. We recognize as well some themes from the German Romantic writers and from the literature of the Wars of Liberation. But for Lagarde, this moral insight also possessed an existential truth. He was idealizing and justifying his own life of suffering and disappointment. Note, there are countless passages in which Lagarde paid tribute to his experience of adversity. Reflecting on all the obstacles of his career, he once wrote, "Without this hard school, I would not have become the free man that I am, and freedom, inner independence from the world and turning towards God, means more to me than any scientific achievement." In his heroic view of man's moral life, Lagarde's personal experience and resentment and the general propositions of cultural criticism most clearly coincided. Lagarde's passionate nationalism was molded by the same moral view. Quote, "I am incapable of understanding the life of a state in any other way except as an analogue of the individual life as a person. The nation, like the individual, has a soul, and in the last analysis, for nations as well as individuals, the soul alone possesses value." Therefore, all the material triumphs of Imperial Germany counted for nothing, indeed were an evil, because they endangered the German soul. Lagarde's criticism was quickened by his nostalgic recollection of an earlier uncorrupted Germany, where the heroic essence of Germanism, of Deutschtum, had prevailed, and had been embodied in a unique race of German heroes. His quarrel with modern Germany arose not because it tolerated injustice or bred poverty, but because it enfeebled that older type of man and destroyed the traditional virtues. The German soul could be saved only by a rededication to common purposes and tasks. Each nation had a task assigned to it by God, and Lagarde thought to identify the national tasks for his people. They were to culminate, as we shall see, in Germany's imperialist destiny, in her colonization of Middle Europa. Beyond imperialism was Lagarde's vision of a Germany reborn, when the soul of the nation and all of its citizens would be fused by a new religion and protected in a new community of Germanic believers. Toward that utopia, Lagarde directed his political efforts and his plans for reform. Clearly, Lagarde's perspective was different from the dominant outlook of the 19th century. He sneered at the real, the practical world, he distrusted positivism, loathed materialism, and mocked progress. He asked questions and set up goals that were different from those of his liberal, enlightened contemporaries. He had contempt for the business world. The cheerful commonplaces of the patriotic literati enraged him and intensified his own commitment to the problematical and tragic. Note, he thought in fact that the literati were the characteristic expression of every soul-destroying force in modern Germany. Quote, "On the surface of the new Reich swims the literat. This poisonous weed must be extirpated from our streams and seas, as must the political system without which this weed could not survive. Then the clean mirror will reflect the flowers of the shore and the stars of heaven. The ancient gods will re-emerge from the depths, and no one will harbor us any ill will." If life had no more to offer than safety, profit, and a little pedantry, if all risks and sacrifices had been taken out, it was a miserable, empty life. Lagarde always thought that he was a solitary fighter. Actually, he belonged to those 19th century dissenters whom Eric Bentley has described as heroic vitalists. Lagarde's faith in heroic vitalism, mixed as it was with a strong nationalist bias, became the foremost prejudice of his temperament, the springboard of his judgment. It was a rankling, exacting prejudice for Lagarde to burden himself with. Such exalted images are rarely realized. Few men regard the world as a perpetual battleground, and few states emulate Sparta. The 19th century, with its universal podsnappery, hid and denied its heroism, and it appears heroic only to us in retrospect. It is only recently that we have discovered and begun to envy the admirable energy of our inner-directed ancestors. Lagarde saw nothing but decline, note, and saw it everywhere. How easily he converted a random episode into further proof of a general decline can be seen from this brief account which he sent to his wife in August 1871. In Kassel, at the railroad station, there were 3 Hessian peasant women, old, weather-beaten, worn out by work and grief. They could only have talked of misery and sorrows, and they looked to me as if they were emigrating from this new Germany that is so liberal, so powerful, and so utterly un-German. We worship foreign gods, that is our undoing. The old Germany was rapidly disappearing, and in its place arose a secular society, a new Babylon, that worshipped mammon and devoured men. Scattered throughout the Deutsche Schriften were the distorted criticisms of modernity that were characteristic of men with utopian inclinations, and that could have been composed by Carlyle or Tennyson as easily as by Lagarde. The evils of the industrial society, particularly in its infancy, were great. They were made more unbearable still by those writers who tortured the minds of men by nostalgic dreams of a past that never was, and prophesied a future that could never be, all the while vilifying, but not explaining, the present. Lagarde had no difficulty in enumerating the manifestations of cultural decay. Time and again he complained about the general retreat from morality, the creeping decline of excellence, the collective descent into passive slothfulness. Nothing was immune from the leveling threat of the rising masses. A frivolous cheapening of standards was evident everywhere, and if it persisted, quote, "we shall all sink into nothingness, for the capital resources of our intellectual life, which we possessed in 1870, have been nearly exhausted in this last period of our history, and we are face to face with bankruptcy." The language, for example, was steadily being corrupted. Quote, "Our speech has ceased to speak. It shouts. It says cute, not beautiful, colossal, not great. It cannot find the right word anymore, because the word is no longer the designation of an object, but the echo of some kind of gossip about the object. The penalty of continuous passivity will be collective death. Quote, all spiritual forces should be set free, all shams stamped out, every organization of idealistic intent allowed and encouraged. If this were done, it would be a joy to be alive. Instead, it is a punishment today to have to witness the withering away of our nation." Lagarde assumed that most Germans were unhappy, and that the new commercial society bred nothing but this discontent and resentment. He assumed, in short, that everybody would sooner or later be afflicted by the same despair that oppressed him. Already in 1853, in his first essay, he wrote, quote, "We are all thoroughly discontented." 35 years later, after Germany had been successfully unified, he complained, "Our life is more joyless than anyone can imagine." This was the insistent theme of his cultural criticism. No work was done that pleased, no art produced which was creative, no faith existed which ennobled and inspired. The typical burgher chased after comfort and success, with no sense for the world beyond. Nothing but dissatisfied and disgruntled hedonism, nothing but mediocrity, dull, drab, middle-class life, materialism, and cultural sterility. Quote, The nation is bored. Therefore, individuals, through smoking, reading, theater-going, bar loitering, home gardening, and the addiction to humor magazines, try to dispel their awareness that ciphers like themselves cannot stand being alone for any length of time at all. His charges against the emptiness of urban existence and against the corruptive impact of commercial life rounded out the usual picture of the conservative aesthetic protest. Quote, "Better to split wood than to continue this contemptible life of civilization and education. We must return to the sources of our existence, on lonely mountain peaks where we are ancestors, not heirs." Lagarde feared the consequences of this cultural anguish, yet by his work spread it ever more widely. Before 1871, Lagarde could hope that the political unification of Germany would effect the spiritual regeneration as well, but Bismarck's Reich quickly dashed his hopes. This form of unification, he charged, would not inspire the nation to a new burst of creativity, but immeasurably hasten its spiritual collapse. There has never been a creation as joyless as this one. Note, Lagarde, of course, was not alone in that judgment. In 1873, Nietzsche published the first of his Unzeitgemäße Betrachtungen, in which he warned against the common mistake of believing Germany's military victory also proved the superiority of its culture. Nothing could be more dangerous. Actually, he foresaw, quote, the defeat, yes, the extirpation of the German spirit in favor of the German Reich. While Nietzsche and Lagarde may have been the most outspoken critics of Bismarck's creation, others soon chimed in. See D. Wilhelm Lutgert, Das Ende des Idealismus and Zeitalter Bismarcks, for a discussion of the German pessimism which sprang up immediately after unification. A suggestive interpretation can be found in Otto Westphal, Feinde Bismarcks, Geistige Grundlagen der deutschen Opposition von 1848 to 1918. The young had not been swept up by any sudden patriotic enthusiasm, and they were bored by the political or military ambitions of the Reich. Quote, they want to fight a war for a concrete ideal, they want danger, risk, sacrifice, and death, and do not want to regurgitate the platitudes that their grandfathers had already chewed on. In every possible way, the new Reich stunted the growth of the free individual and thus annihilated the only source of cultural vitality. Quote, everything depends on the human being, and Germany lacks nothing so much as men. There is nothing toward which Germany, with its adoration of the state, of public opinion, of culture, and of success, directs so much hostility as toward the individual, who alone can bring it life and honor. The mounting disgust with modernity was the underlying passion of Lagarde's cultural criticism and of the ambitious reforms he proposed. For 20 years, he explored the causes, the symptoms, and the cure of Germany's spiritual collapse, discovering in turn that the Jews, the liberals, the academicians were the cause, and a new religion, a new body politic, a new nobility, and a new educational system the cure. That many of his strictures were just and incisive cannot be gainsaid. Every critical thinker in Germany had similar misgivings, and like-minded criticism, often just as intense, has been heard in Western countries of late, reaching an alarming crescendo in our own country. Lagarde's inadequacy lies rather in his analysis, in his intemperate and unhistorical personification of social deficiencies, in his paradoxically liberal belief that social tinkering could effect vast spiritual reforms. One is struck as well by the pathological prominence of Lagarde's conspiratorial view of society. His picture of Germany was no different from his picture of Göttingen, where the pure Lagarde was beset by worthless colleagues. In his cultural criticism, the conspiratorial view accounts for the brutality of some of his plans, but it has as its complement Lagarde's historic conception of men and nations. It was the heroic image that allowed him to appear to himself and others as an idealist, as a disinterested fighter for old values and transcendental ideals. Lagarde was an idealist in the several senses in which Germans have used this term during the past century. Note, and he was invariably hailed as an idealist. In an important catalogue of right-wing heroes published during the Weimar Republic, we find Lagarde characterized as an idealist in politics. He knew perfectly well that politics had to be concrete and practical, but just because the concrete is so unidealistic, the real politiker in Germany must be an idealist. Franz Heine, Lagarde als Politiker, 1925. In his aesthetic heroic view of men and nations, in his pseudo-religious faith in the irrational, the supernatural, and the divine, in his glorification of the genie, he was close to the historical movement of the late 18th century known as Idealism. In his depreciation of the political and economic man, of the common man of everyday life, and of the political culture that adapts itself to him, he appeared as an idealist because he had turned his back on modernity, on practicality, because he preferred to legislate for an implausible future rather than to reform an intractable present. The ultimate goals of Lagarde's cultural criticism appeared idealistic. The immediate reforms often involved physical violence and brutality. Again, we are reminded of certain characteristics of Lagarde's biography. Since childhood, he had been accustomed to hate concretely, but to attach his love to an ideal object that was dead and beyond recovery. To many Germans, then, Lagarde was an idealist, in the same way that Hitler was to be an idealist for another generation, and in a way that Marx and Bismarck never were. He helped to establish the idealism of anti-modernity, and, as we shall presently see, he incorporated into his program of reform radical provisions for violence and tyranny. But these, as Lagarde's reputation was to prove, could be sanctioned without depriving the resentment against modernity of its idealistic respectability.